Hello, my name is Diane, and today I want to talk about all of the books I read this year that were published this year. So all 2024 releases. I read 10 of them, which by number I don't think is a ton, but by percentage of the books that I read, this was almost a third of everything that I read this year came out this year. I will eventually do at least a list, if not talking about all of the books that I read this year. But today I want to talk specifically about all of the new books that I read this year. The first book is Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands. This is the second book in the Emily Wilde series by Heather Fawcett. This follows our main character, Emily, who is studying Fae, and she is a scholar and a researcher trying to, in the first book, put together a full encyclopedia of all of the different types of Fae that exist. And in this one, she is trying to do a map of all of the doorways that lead into the Fae realm. She does have a few companions with her. I really like the character of Emily. I really like the writing in this. I think it's very compelling. I think what Heather Fawcett does with the Fae and the different types and the encounters that Emily has with them are really interesting. And I just think these are very engaging books. And I'm really looking forward to the third book, which comes out in just a couple months now. The next new release I read is The Slain Divine by David Dalglish. This is the third and final book in the Vagrant Gods trilogy. I never read the first book in this trilogy. I started with the second book. I've talked about this before. It really didn't affect my reading or my enjoyment of this story at all. I found it very easy to fall into this world and get to know these characters. We do follow a fairly large cast of characters jumping between points of view, which is something that I typically enjoy, and I think it was really well done in this story. All of the characters felt like they had their own unique personalities and distinct voices, and their relationships with each other were all very interesting to see. How they all work together with a group. We also see some people on the other side. The story follows a island nation who in the first book is invaded by an empire. They take over the island. They kill the gods of the island. They also kill the royal family. However, the prince survives and he is taken in by this group who is planning to rebel against the empire once they have a good plan of attack and resources. And they train him and work together with him to try and take back their home. The magic system in this world is based around the gods. People have faith and pray to the gods, and that gives the gods power. And in turn, the gods can give select people power, where they may get magic or some type of ability gifted from the god. I think it's a really cool magic system, the way it has this give and take between the people and the gods, and it definitely plays a huge role in this story. So I wish I had read the first book because I ended up enjoying it so much, but I'm glad I read it at all because I really had a good time exploring this world and getting to know these characters. Then I read The Butcher of the Forest by Primi Mohammed. This is a fairly short fantasy story. In it, we follow a woman who lives in this village that is near a forest that everyone in the village knows is very dangerous. You don't go in it. If you go in it, you're probably never coming back. And the tyrant who has taken over their land and rules over them has two young children who don't know this, and they go into the forest and don't come back. So the tyrant chooses this woman, our main character, who is the only person who has ever gone into the forest and returned. So he forces her to go find his children and bring them home. She really doesn't want to do this, but she doesn't have a choice. So we follow along as she goes into the forest and tries to find these children, knowing that it is a terrible place because she has been there before, and also knowing that if she does not find them in a certain amount of time, she's probably never going to be able to get out either. And the forest is definitely working against her. Not only the creatures within it, but the forest itself. It can change and manipulate things, and the creatures are very tricky. They like to make deals and play games that are not in the benefit of the people who wander into the forest. I don't think this was a perfect story in all of the things that happen within it, but I did find it so compelling to go along with this character and find out what was going to happen, to see all of the twists and turns along the way of not knowing exactly what she can trust, who she can trust, and hoping that she's gonna find these kids and make it out. Then I read The Truth of the Aleke, which is the second book in the Forever Desert series by Moses Oziotomi. I love this novella series. I just find the writing so gripping in going along with our main characters. The stories take place in a desert that has cities in it, but they're very spread out. They're very sparse, and resources within them are very limited because they're in the middle of a desert. Our first book follows a young boy who goes to try and find water to save his mother and hopefully save his city from this awful deal that they have with these neighboring people that allows them to get just enough water to live, but water is still very scarce and nobody really has enough of it. In The Truth of the Aleke, we follow a different character in a different place, and he knows the history of what happened in that first book based on what he's been taught, but this is 100 years later. So what he knows is the version of the truth that has been passed down publicly, and we follow along with him as he goes on his own journey of learning more things about the world around him. And I think those journeys of discovery and the way that they're presented in these books are so compelling, of seeing this character go out into the world for the first time and learn things firsthand instead of just what they were told, particularly in the second book, where I, as a reader, knew things that our main character did not because I read the events of the first book as they were happening. So I knew what actually is the history, and he only knows the history he was taught and things about the world. But I think there were a lot more things to be uncertain of in that second book. And I thought that was really cool to see that the good and the bad was a little murkier. There were a lot more people involved than in that first book, and I am really looking forward to the third book that's going to come out in this series. Then I read The Warm Hands of Ghosts by Catherine Arden. This is a historical fantasy following a woman who was a field nurse in France, and because she was injured on the front lines, she is sent home to Canada, and there she has lived through the aftermath of the explosion that happened during the war in Canada. So now she is alone. Her brother is a soldier still in the war, and she is informed that he has died in battle. However, there's something off about this news being delivered to her, and she just needs to know the truth for herself. So she ends up going back to France to find out what actually happened to her brother. And she is helping this woman who has brought her back with her in her hospital, so she's still involved in the war efforts once again, while in her spare time trying to find her brother. We also follow her brother in his story starts a little before hers, where we see leading up to him disappearing what happened to him, and actually following along with him to find out what actually happened while we're watching her try and find out what happened. I really liked the brother and sister dynamic of this. I really liked their individual stories of them coping with the trauma of being at war on different ends of it, of him being in the battlefield, being in the trenches, and her being a field nurse, and the things that they've both seen and the things that they're both coming to terms with, and how they're trying to move forward through it, and also how they're trying to get back to one another. I would say this is much more historical fiction than fantasy. There are fantastical elements in the story, but it feels more magical realism. There wasn't as much as I would have expected, but I did really enjoy this. Then I read The Last Delivery by Evan Dam. This is a graphic novel following a courier who has to deliver a package, and they end up at this mansion, and there's a party going on, and no one who works there, no one who is attending the party is willing to sign for this package, so they have to navigate somehow and find the actual recipient so that they can sign for the package and they can be done with this delivery. This is a pretty dark story. There are some terrible things going on at this party, some pretty gruesome things. It's very bizarre, and our little courier's just trying to drop off this package and no one will sign for it, and trying to get through and get past all of these very dangerous things going on. Very weird, kind of gruesome, but I overall enjoyed this. Then I read Le Fay by Sophie Keach. This is the second book in the Morgan Le Fay trilogy. I have been loving the series. This is a retelling of the life of Morgan Le Fay from Arthurian legend. And in the first book, we start when she is a young girl and follow her into adulthood. And then in the second book, we continue on with her life from where we left off. Although the major points in her life are kind of already existing because this is a story that gets retold over and over and over again, I really like Sophie Keach's spin on what happened, on the way that she explains and describes things. I think the writing is so beautiful and so engaging. I really like this version of Morgan. We do have some other familiar characters from Arthurian legend, but the story definitely centers on Morgan, and all of the other characters are just in her life. We only see them when they are in her life. We only follow her. So we don't always know the nuances of their decisions and their actions, or the motivations behind what they're doing and what they're trying to achieve. We really only know what Morgan knows of them, and I think that's a really interesting way to approach this story, because we typically follow Arthur or Merlin in these types of retellings, or sometimes the knights. So I like that there are a lot of familiar plot points within this, but we're seeing it entirely from Morgan's perspective, and I think that she is a really interesting and a really compelling character in this story. I'm really looking forward to the third book. Don't really want this story to end because I'm enjoying it so much, but I am, especially after the way the second book ended, I am really looking forward to seeing what happens with Morgan specifically in this version. Then I read A Sorceress Comes to Call by T. Kingfisher. This is a story about a girl whose mother is a sorceress, and she is a terrible person. She takes advantage of men, her benefactors, and when she's done with them, or when someone has slighted her, she does terrible things to them. She also has a way of magically controlling our main character, and it's just a very strange home life for her in some of the things that go on that she has just sort of normalized within her life, and then sees that other people don't live like that and realizes, wow, this is really weird. And she's also terrified of her mother, justifiably. So her mother's new mark is this squire, and she's decided she's gonna woo him and marry him and live off of his wealth. And our main character gets to know the squire's sister, who we also see her perspective in the story, and she knows this lady is not a good lady, but she can't prove anything. She can't outright accuse her of anything because she doesn't really have anything of substance that anyone would believe her, other than her feeling of just get a bad vibe from this lady. And the daughter is getting attached to the people that live in this household, to the squire, to the sister particularly, and she knows that her mother is ultimately going to do something to harm one, if not all of them. And it gets pretty dark, it gets pretty intense. There are some scary things happening. It stays pretty approachable. There are some funny moments to break the tension when things are happening. Some of the things that are happening are just very strange. And I feel like it strikes a good balance between not being too heavy, but also having some pretty awful things happening. And I really enjoyed this. Then I read A Feather So Black by Lyra Celine. This is the first book in the Fair Folk series. I thought that this was young adult, and it's definitely not. So when I started reading it, I was a little confused because there's a lot of lusting, a lot of real heavy lusting in the first maybe 40% of this before anything really becomes of it. And I thought this feels kind of inappropriate for a young adult book. So I finally looked it up and was like, oh, it's not a young adult book, it's an adult book. And then once I got past that halfway mark and things started getting a little spicy, I was like, okay, it's definitely an adult book. And that's just not something that I enjoy reading. I did like the plot of this, but as the plot picked up, so did the romance. And as the romance picked up, my interest and my engagement really plummeted, and I was kind of not paying that much attention to the last like third of this book. Probably I did finish it. Our main character is actually a changeling. I think 12 years ago, 12 girls were taken by the Fae, and only one of them, the princess, was replaced with a changeling. The queen decided she's just going to raise the changeling, and eventually, hopefully one day, they'll be able to rescue these girls. And there are these doorways into the fairy realm, but they have been closed off, and they finally figure out a way to open up one of them. So they send our main character and also the prince alongside her because he is supposed to marry the princess that was taken. So our main character has also been given this secondary secret mission of stealing some fairy artifact. There's this weird history and dynamic between our main character and the prince. I don't know, there's a lot of interesting things happening in the plot with trying to find this weapon, trying to realize the queen's intentions, and the changeling realizing her actual relationship with the queen and how complex that is for her specifically. And I think all of plot-wise and world-wise, I think there are a lot of interesting things happening. But for me, the romance is such a main focus and gets much steamier than I really ever want to read. And the last book I have to talk about is A House Like an Accordion by Audrey Burgess. This follows a woman who wakes up one morning and her hand has disappeared. It's just gone. And she has a husband and 2 teenage daughters, and she's going about her morning routine trying to hide the fact that her hand is missing and trying to just pretend everything's normal so as not to alarm them. She does realize pretty quickly that this must mean that her father is alive. Her father has always had this ability to draw things from life, but in doing so, he takes whatever that thing is and traps it into his drawing, basically. So she realizes that her father is alive and he must be drawing her for some reason. And she needs to figure out where he is, find him, and stop this before she completely disappears. So she sets off trying to find all of the many places she has lived in her life, thinking there's surely a clue somewhere that will lead her to her father. And as she sort of retraces her past, and we learn that she's got gaps in her memory that she can't explain, all of these peculiar things that she's never been able to understand or find an explanation for, as she's coming to terms with certain things, realizing certain things, and also revealing certain things about her family and her own past. I don't know that I loved this book. I wouldn't widely recommend it, I don't think, but I did really enjoy this. I think a lot of the things that she comes to terms with and the sort of conversations and realizations that are happening were very interesting. It's very strange. Some of the things that happen feel a little bit odd in some of the decisions that she's making, some of the things that are included. But I think overall, I liked the way that the story played out, of seeing someone cope with not only her current family life that she's sort of struggling with at this point, but also come to terms with her past, with her grandmother and her parents and her brother as well, and all of the different layers of that. So this was pretty different from the type of fantasy that I normally read. I don't read a lot of contemporary things, but I overall really enjoyed this. So those are all of the 2024 releases that I read this year. I'm sure in the beginning of next year at least, I'll read a few more, or maybe the end of this year. Let me know if you've read any of these, or if there's any other books that came out this year that you read and really loved. Otherwise, that's all for me today. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you next time. Bye.